You are getting this wrong. The open beta has left Lance mains scratching their heads. Opinions are divided, and today I want to throw my thoughts into the ring. Does Lance suck now? Let's talk. As the world's foremost Lance tuber, my opinions count more than anybody else's. Okay, seriously, but if you disagree, you're perfectly entitled to your opinion. I've seen some complaints, and honestly, I think some of you are just misunderstanding some of the changes here. Although, on another aside, that's sad that the Lance changes haven't really resonated with you. I hope you can learn to appreciate them for what they are, or find another weapon that suits you. So welcome to Let's Talk, where I'm going to be providing my opinion on some of the things that come up in the community. Informal, and I'm not going to try and match up every single piece of footage to what I'm trying to say. It can take forever sometimes. Also, an excellent chance for us to get to know each other. Hi, I'm Dunks. I've been loving playing Lance and Monster Hunter for quite a while now. In order to get to know each other a bit, I'd love for you to answer this question. What's made you smile recently? For me, I've been loving the crunchy leaves of autumn over here in Britain. It is gorgeous. And it's scarf season again. I get to wear scarves. Right, let's take this move by move, as I think that would be a much more structural way to approach this. So let's start with the basic 3 thrust combo. I feel like we now have a lot more delineation between the mid and high thrusts. Formerly, wherever possible, we'd aim for the high thrust because it had a higher motion value, and it never really made sense why it had a higher motion value. Here, in Wilds, we still have that motion value difference, but now we have a speed difference. The high thrusts are now noticeably slower than the mid thrusts. And that speed isn't just felt in how fast you do the thrust, but also the recovery time into guarding. So that forces you to make a choice. Are you going to go for the higher damage but maybe slightly more risky and sluggish high thrusts? Or are you going to keep up a more continuous offense with the mid thrusts? And it does feel weird to now prefer mid thrusts, as it has a lot more speed and a lot more synergy with focus mode. I've seen it said a lot, and I definitely agree. It feels like focus mode is intended to be on at all times. With focus mode, the mid thrust can now be maneuvered ever so slightly. You wouldn't really use it for evasive purposes, but you can use it to keep on a monster and maybe just keep up with its wiggling movesets. So, my take, I actually find that these changes make the standard combo a lot more interesting. They force us to make much more deliberate choices in our approach. And as a result of that, the weapon now feels like it has a lot more depth. Look, I've been playing the Lance for a long time now, thousands of hunts over the 5th gen, and it actually feels really refreshing to have some shake up in the moveset and in how we approach the weapon. And, spoiler alert, you're actually going to see that come up quite a lot now. Depth. It now feels like the Lance has a lot more depth. Right. Guarding. The counter cancels of old are gone, and instead we have just straight up guarding, and then a manual input to hit back. Doing this in 5th gen was not a good idea because of the post-poke cooldowns. Right. I love these changes for a few reasons, and it's not because the old system was wrong. Firstly, it's a pretty fundamental change in the flow of the weapon. It really switches up the experience, and that's great. The second thing is, it's probably a bit easier now to teach newcomers about the weapon. You've got a big old shield. It makes logical sense that you can just use it as and when without having to hop first. And the third reason is that giving us a manual input multiplies the options available to us afterwards. It's no longer just an automated thing. We have options, quite a few of them, and a lot of depth. See, there it is again. Payback thrust, mid thrust, guard dash, dash attack, a lot more options to suit the situation. Some of these even get souped up with the perfect guard. Payback thrust and mid thrust can be aimed now, and the dash attack becomes its own hoity-toity follow-up thrust, with added hits to close the distance to the monster. Looking at these options, Mid-thrust is actually surprisingly attractive given its speed and its synergy with focus mode. Then we've got payback thrust, which some people don't like because of the commitment to it, but I never found that to be an issue. But most surprisingly of all, the dash attack. This always felt like a bit of a gimmick in past games, but now it feels really good for closing the distance. I can imagine that if you can learn to perfect guard Ray Dow's railgun attack, and then do a follow-up rush, you can hit him with that, and then because his face is newly wounded, you might even be able to squeeze in the wound attack. That'd be so cool. Perfect guard also builds up clash encounters a lot more quickly, which is nice, but is intangible, so I wouldn't really count that as too much of a blessing. While I appreciate that we do have much reduced knockback, it would have been great to still kept some of the insta-block properties like no chip damage and no hit to your stamina. One really cool thing though, because of the perfect guarding, I did find myself over the course of the beta not thinking, man, I really miss those guard skills, like the guard armor skills. And that made me think, maybe I can play through this game without needing those. If they even still exist, we don't know yet. But admittedly, I am a comfy lancer and I love all those guard skills. So I may end up resorting back to my cozy lo-fi ways. I definitely miss guard up though, especially against Dogface with his ground quake move. But at least it felt like you could see that coming, you could sheathe and you could avoid it. Unlike say Rajang's laser beam in Sunbreak, which just felt really unfair and really difficult to avoid because it would just come out of nowhere. Oh, and of course they have also incorporated that shield slap into every successful guard. It feels like built-in guard bash, so it's great to have both guard bash and insta-block effectively at the same time, even if they are slightly different. And it's lovely to get a complimentary knockout every now and then. Right, enough of that. Now let's move on to that all-new thrilling fourth thrust. And this is what I was referring to fundamentally at the start of the video. That charge counter. I've seen a lot of complaints about it and I think people are getting it wrong. Because of its visual similarity to the old counter state, I think a lot of people are thinking that this is some move that you're supposed to set up in advance. That it should be available at any point. But effectively, you have guarding and power guarding for that now, as we've already discussed. So you don't need to have that counter state readily available. I think the point of the charge counter is to make a play, or have a gamble for example. See, as an alternative, you could go for the triple thrust, which can be cancelled into a guard midway through. It's still not a perfectly safe move, but then that's Monster Hunter. And that's what I want to say here. Monster Hunter is a game about calculated risk. In light of that, we now have the charge counter, where you can choose, instead of doing that triple thrust, to anticipate that the monster's going to attack, and start a charge counter when you get there. Then you're taking that gamble to go, okay, I'm hoping that the monster will attack me here, and that I can get more out of this. But it's still a relatively low risk because after all, if they don't attack, you can just do a pretty strong thrust. This particularly resonated with me when I was once hunting a Chatacabra, and as it was getting up I thought, I'm doing my triple thrust now. I reckon by the time I get to the charge counter opportunity, he's probably going to attack me. So I went and took the risk and I was rewarded for it, and it felt great. So no, I don't think you're supposed to set it up in advance. I think it's an on-the-fly choice and a bit of a gamble that you have to make. You can easily just go with the triple thrust, and that's still great. Lastly, after that fourth poke, there's a subtle effect going on here that transforms the weapon. You can just get right on with your next attack. So the weapon flows in a hyper offense. And that's the next point I want to make. Not only do we have more depth, we now have far more flow. And because we have more flow, while some aspects of the weapon feel slower, and to be honest most things will feel slower compared to Rise and Sunbreak, even though we have some slower attacks, we have a lot more flow between the attacks, so to me the weapon actually feels faster at times. Not faster necessarily than Sunbreak, but definitely faster than World. And to be honest, sometimes some of the speed in Sunbreak felt a little bit janky anyway, like with that spiral thrust where you could just end up throwing yourself off the cliff if you weren't careful. And of course, there's a surprise that the wide sweep now hits pretty hard. And I do appreciate that you can't do it consecutively. It's like in those 2 opportunities that you have it, you have to make a calculated choice as to when you're going to do that. Which reminds me, leaping thrust and guard dash. Because of course from neutral now, that 2-buttoned attack that used to be wide sweep is now a leaping thrust. A change which I'm mildly happy on. I mean, sure, it's pretty slow now, and it only hits twice, so it looks like it might be less feasible as an attack, but we don't know how it scales with element, so it might be better in the real thing. Also, the synergy that we used to have with guard dash back in Rise Break now feels a lot more awkward. And this is one of my bigger complaints, is that it felt so finicky to try and go leaping thrust, guard dash. You have to be really specific with your inputs. I found that I got a lot more consistency out of it by just holding down the inputs with the guard dash. Otherwise you'd end up doing just some random poke or some random block. It feels like you can't buffer the input as easily. Okay, and that just about leaves us with the Focus Strike. As I said in my review of the open beta, link below, go and give it some love. I'm pretty happy with wounds and focus mode as an overall mechanic. The Lance has an interesting balance to it. Short range, but very quick startup. Which is more than can be said for our explosive cousin. Which, by the way, Gun Lance, very fun. I might even be dabbling in it this time. Anyway, the Lance's Focus Strike reminds me a lot of the shield charge that we had back in Rise Break. Why? Because there's a whole portion to it where you're just carrying on your momentum and you just sort of have to aim the camera in the right direction and hope for the best. Really hard to control. I would have liked for it to have been a bit more long range, but as a Lancer, I'm typically right up in the monster's dribbling dentures anyway. So, does the Lance suck now? I would say no. If anything, it feels fresh. It has far more depth and far more flow to it. Look, at the end of the day, if these changes aren't for you and you just can't get used to them, I feel for you. That must be really sad, especially if you've been playing Lance for a long time. Maybe the developers will do some adjustments to the timing of some things to make it feel better for you. Maybe in the next installment, it will go back to the way it was. And if not, hopefully you can find a weapon that suits your preferences anyway. I am really looking forward to it. I hope you are too. So there you go, those are my thoughts. What do you think? And don't forget to tell me, what have you been loving in life lately? Take care, have a lovely week, and I'll catch you on the other side.